In February 1945, a Soviet tank crew operating near the Oder River discovered an abandoned American M4 Sherman tank that had been delivered through Lend-Lease and subsequently disabled during a German counterattack. What began as simple salvage curiosity became a revelation that would expose fundamental flaws in Soviet armored doctrine, not through official testing or engineering analysis, but through the unauthorized appropriation of foreign equipment by soldiers who understood their own vehicles well enough to recognize when something was categorically superior. This is the story of how Sergeant Dmitry Volkov and his crew spent 3 weeks secretly operating a repaired Sherman, documenting fuel efficiency that was nearly double that of their standard T-34, and how their findings were systematically suppressed because acknowledging them would require admitting that Soviet tank design prioritized production volume over crew survival and operational range. It begins not with espionage or tactical brilliance, but with a broken transmission and the desperate pragmatism of men who had learned that survival often depended on improvisation, the Red Army neither authorized nor acknowledged. The Sherman had been part of a convoy supporting Polish units attached to the First Belarusian Front. German forces had ambushed the column near Kustrin, destroying 2 T-34s and disabling the Sherman with what appeared to be a track hit. The Polish crew had abandoned the vehicle and withdrawn with surviving units, leaving the tank where it sat, too damaged for immediate recovery, too exposed for systematic salvage. When Volkov's crew discovered it 4 days later during a reconnaissance patrol, the Sherman was still intact, aside from the damaged track assembly and what looked like transmission problems. Soviet doctrine dictated that disabled foreign equipment be reported to divisional headquarters for proper salvage assessment. Volkov made a different calculation. His own T-34 was on its 3rd transmission in 8 months, leaked oil from every seal, and consumed fuel at a rate that limited operational range to roughly 80 kilometers before requiring refueling. The Sherman, even damaged, represented an opportunity to understand why American tanks seemed to operate longer between maintenance cycles. The repair took 6 days and was accomplished entirely through unauthorized acquisition of parts and labor. Volkov's driver, Corporal Ivan Chesnikov, had worked in a tractor factory before conscription and possessed the kind of mechanical intuition that military training could not teach. He examined the Sherman's damaged track assembly and realized that the brake was clean. A single link had shattered, but the rest of the track was intact. Soviet T-34 tracks used a different pin system and couldn't be adapted directly, but Chesnikov fabricated a replacement link using steel plate from a destroyed German half-track and pins machined from salvaged axle components. The transmission damage was more complex. The gearbox had been shocked by the track failure, cracking several gear teeth and jamming the shift mechanism. Chesnikov spent 2 days disassembling the transmission housing, filed the damaged gears smooth enough to engage without binding, and reassembled the system with the careful precision of someone who understood that mechanical tolerance was the difference between mobility and death. By February 23rd, the Sherman was operational. Volkov faced a choice that revealed the fundamental tension between military discipline and survival pragmatism. Official protocol required reporting the repair and surrendering the vehicle to salvage operations. But his T-34 was barely functional. His crew was exhausted from constant mechanical failures, and the front was relatively static as Soviet forces prepared for the final push toward Berlin. He made the decision that soldiers throughout history have made when institutional procedure conflicts with tactical reality. He concealed the Sherman in a damaged barn 2 kilometers from his unit's position and told no one except his crew. For the next 3 weeks, whenever official duties permitted, they operated the Sherman in areas away from Soviet observation, testing its performance and documenting characteristics that should not have been possible according to everything they understood about armored vehicle design. The first revelation came during a simple fuel consumption test. Volkov filled the Sherman's tanks completely, using fuel borrowed from a supply depot through methods that required no documentation, and drove a measured course of 50 kilometers across mixed terrain. The Sherman consumed approximately 90 liters. The same course in a T-34 typically required 160 to 180 liters, depending on terrain and operational tempo. Volkov repeated the test 3 times with consistent results. The Sherman was achieving nearly double the fuel efficiency of the T-34, despite being heavier and carrying comparable armor. The implication was staggering. American tanks could operate at extended ranges, not because they carried more fuel, but because their engines and transmissions were fundamentally more efficient. Soviet doctrine emphasized mass production and numerical superiority. But if individual American tanks could operate twice as long between refueling, numerical advantage became less decisive when Soviet formations had to halt for logistics while American units continued advancing. Chesnokov identified the technical factors that explained the efficiency disparity. The Sherman's powertrain used a significantly more sophisticated transmission design, a synchronous system that reduced friction during gear changes and distributed power more efficiently across the drivetrain. The T-34's transmission was simpler, cheaper to manufacture and easier to repair, but it operated with mechanical losses that translated directly into wasted fuel. The Sherman's engine, a radial aircraft design adapted for ground use, ran at lower sustained RPM for equivalent power output, reducing fuel consumption during normal operation. The T-34's diesel engine was powerful and reliable, but it achieved that reliability through brute force engineering that accepted inefficiency as the cost of simplicity. Every technical comparison revealed the same pattern. Soviet design prioritized production speed and field maintainability, while American design optimized operational performance even when that required more complex manufacturing. The crew documented their findings in a notebook that Volkov kept hidden in his personal effects. Fuel consumption rates, maintenance observations, operational characteristics that differentiated the Sherman from Soviet equipment. They noted that the Sherman's wider tracks distributed weight more effectively, reducing ground pressure and improving cross-country mobility in soft terrain. They observed that the turret traverse mechanism was faster and smoother, allowing quicker target engagement. They discovered that the suspension system absorbed impacts more effectively, reducing crew fatigue during extended operations. Each observation reinforced the same uncomfortable conclusion. American tanks were not just different from Soviet tanks, they were better in ways that directly affected combat effectiveness and crew survival. The Red Army had won through mass production and tactical doctrine that accepted catastrophic casualty rates. But the Steel suggested that victory could have been achieved with fewer deaths if Soviet design philosophy had prioritized efficiency over volume. The Sherman was not stolen for glory or defiance. It was appropriated because soldiers understand what bureaucrats cannot, that survival often depends on equipment that works rather than equipment that exists in sufficient quantity. The Steel told a story that doctrine refused to acknowledge. The fuel efficiency disparity created tactical implications that Volkov understood instinctively but could not fully articulate until he attempted to map them systematically. In late February, Soviet forces were preparing for offensive operations that would push through remaining German defensive positions toward Berlin. Standard operational planning allocated fuel reserves based on T-34 consumption rates, approximately 200 liters per 100 kilometers of mixed combat and travel movement. This meant that tank units required refueling after roughly 80 to 90 kilometers of actual advance, with the remainder of fuel capacity reserved for combat maneuvers, positional adjustments, and emergency withdrawal. The logistics chain supporting armored operations was built entirely around these consumption parameters. Every fuel depot, every supply convoy, every operational timeline assumed that Soviet tanks would need refueling at these intervals. The Sherman's efficiency suggested that this entire logistical architecture was based on accepting unnecessary limitations. Volkov conducted a calculated experiment on March 2nd. He drove the Sherman on a route that approximated a combat advance, varying speed, making tactical stops, executing the kind of evasive maneuvers that consumed additional fuel during actual operations. He covered 130 kilometers before the fuel gauge reached the quarter-tank mark that Soviet doctrine designated as requiring immediate refueling. The same operational profile in a T-34 would have required refueling after 70 to 80 kilometers. The difference was not marginal. It represented a fundamental expansion of operational range that would allow armored units to maintain offensive momentum without pausing for logistics. An American tank formation could advance 50 to 60 kilometers further than a Soviet formation before requiring fuel supply, which in mobile warfare often meant the difference between exploiting breakthrough and allowing enemy forces to establish new defensive positions. Chesnokov understood the engineering factors, but questioned whether the efficiency advantage was worth the increased mechanical complexity. The Sherman's transmission required more precise manufacturing tolerances, which meant it was harder to repair in field conditions and more vulnerable to damage from improper maintenance. The synchromesh gears that reduced friction could be damaged by forcing shifts under load, a common practice among Soviet tankers trained on simpler systems. The radial engine, while fuel-efficient, required more careful temperature management and used components that couldn't be fabricated in field workshops. Soviet design philosophy accepted lower efficiency because it created vehicles that could be maintained by conscripted soldiers with minimal technical training. American design assumed professional maintenance crews with specialized tools and factory-quality replacement parts. The Sherman was more efficient, but efficiency was useless if the tank couldn't be repaired when something broke. The debate between Volkov and Chesnokov revealed a deeper ideological tension that neither fully recognized. Soviet military doctrine was built on the premise that quantity and simplicity could overwhelm qualitative superiority, produce enough tanks, even if each individual tank was less capable, and numerical advantage would compensate for technical limitations. American doctrine prioritized individual vehicle performance, accepting higher production costs and maintenance complexity in exchange for tactical flexibility and reduced logistics burden. Both approaches had succeeded in their respective theaters, but the Sherman's fuel efficiency suggested that Soviet doctrine carried hidden costs that were never calculated in official assessments. How many offensives had stalled because fuel supplies couldn't keep pace with advance? How many tactical opportunities had been lost because tank units had to halt for refueling while German forces established new defensive positions? The mathematics of fuel and distance translated directly into lives, Soviet lives, lost because operational range had been sacrificed for production simplicity. By mid-March, Volkov had accumulated enough data to understand that what he had discovered was both militarily significant and politically dangerous. The fuel efficiency disparity was not speculation or anecdotal observation. It was quantifiable, repeatable, and impossible to dismiss as measurement error. But reporting these findings would require explaining how he had obtained them, which meant admitting that he had concealed and operated foreign equipment without authorization. More problematically, the findings implicitly criticized Soviet tank design and production priorities at a time when the Red Army's industrial achievement was being celebrated as proof of socialist superiority. Volkov was a sergeant with a primary school education. He had no illusions about how the system would respond to a non-commissioned soldier suggesting that Soviet engineering was inferior to American methods. The truth was documented in his notebook. The truth was also unpublishable, unspeakable, and dangerous to possess. The crew made the decision collectively. They would continue operating the Sherman when circumstances permitted, but they would not report their findings through official channels. The notebook would remain hidden. The knowledge would be retained as practical information that might improve their own survival, but it would not be shared with commanders who would either dismiss it or punish them for discovering it. This was the accommodation that soldiers throughout history have made when institutional reality conflicts with observed fact. Preserve the knowledge privately, adapt tactics accordingly, and accept that some truths cannot be spoken without consequences that exceed any benefit the truth might provide. The Sherman ran more efficiently than the T-34. That was a fact. What to do with that fact was a question that the Red Army's command structure had neither asked nor wanted answered. The irony was not lost on Volkov. The Soviet Union had received thousands of Sherman tanks through Lend-Lease, which meant that Soviet commanders and maintenance personnel had extensive experience operating American equipment. The fuel efficiency characteristics that Volkov was documenting so carefully were already known to Soviet logistics officers who managed mixed tank formations. But institutional knowledge and institutional acknowledgement were different things. The Red Army could use American tanks while maintaining that Soviet designs were superior. It could accept foreign equipment as temporary assistance while asserting that socialist industrial methods produced optimal results. What it could not do was admit that fundamental design choices had created measurable disadvantages that translated into operational limitations and unnecessary casualties. The mathematics of fuel and distance were clear. The politics of acknowledging those mathematics made them invisible. The Sherman proved what Soviet doctrine could not admit, that efficiency and survivability were not bourgeois luxuries, but tactical necessities that directly affected operational success. The fuel burned more slowly, the range extended further, and every kilometer of additional range represented lives that might have been saved if production priorities had valued crew survival as highly as production volume. And now I invite you to leave in the comments where you are watching from and the exact time you're hearing this story. We're interested in knowing how far and at what moments of the day or night these documented accounts reach. On March 15th, Volkov's unauthorized operation of the Sherman nearly ended when Lieutenant Pavel Grigoriev, his platoon commander, conducted a surprise inspection of equipment dispersed in secondary positions. Grigoriev discovered the concealed Sherman and demanded an explanation that Volkov could not provide without incriminating himself. The lieutenant's response revealed the complex pragmatism that characterized Soviet military operations at the war's end. He did not report the violation, but he also did not ignore it. Instead, he insisted on personally inspecting the vehicle and understanding why his sergeant had risked court-martial to maintain foreign equipment. What followed was a demonstration that transformed Grigoriev from skeptical superior to complicit participant in documentation that would never be officially acknowledged. Volkov explained the fuel efficiency findings with the directness of someone who had exhausted his capacity for deception. He showed Grigoriev the notebook containing consumption data, maintenance observations, and operational comparisons between the Sherman and their assigned T-34. Grigoriev was a career officer who had commanded tank units since 1942 and understood armored warfare through experience rather than theoretical training. He read the documented fuel consumption rates with the expression of someone receiving confirmation of something he had suspected but never been able to prove. Soviet logistics had always been the limiting factor in offensive operations, not German resistance, not terrain, but the inability to maintain fuel supply to advancing units. If American tanks could operate at double the range, that explained why Allied advances in Western Europe had maintained momentum that Soviet offensives could not match despite superior numbers. Grigoriev made a decision that demonstrated both tactical intelligence and political awareness. He would allow Volkov to continue operating the Sherman, but only under conditions that served legitimate military purposes and created plausible deniability if the operation were discovered. The approaching offensive toward Berlin would create opportunities to test the Sherman's performance in actual combat conditions, while attributing its presence to battlefield salvage rather than unauthorized appropriation. Grigoriev would document the vehicle's operational characteristics through official reports that avoided mentioning the fuel efficiency disparity explicitly, but created a record that future analysts might recognize as significant. This was how truth survived in systems that punished inconvenient observations, through indirect documentation that preserved facts while avoiding the political implications of those facts. The first combat operation occurred on March 21st, when Grigoriev's platoon was tasked with supporting an infantry assault against a German defensive position near Silo. Volkov operated the Sherman alongside two T-34s in a coordinated attack that allowed direct performance comparison under identical conditions. The engagement lasted approximately 40 minutes and involved movement across 5 kilometers of contested terrain, suppressive fire against fortified positions, and tactical repositioning under artillery fire. All 3 tanks completed the mission successfully, but when they returned to assembly positions for refueling, the operational cost became apparent. The 2 T-34s required complete refueling, approximately 300 liters each. The Sherman required 140 liters. Grigoriev documented the fuel consumption in his after-action report with clinical precision, noting that foreign equipment demonstrated enhanced fuel efficiency during sustained combat operations. But the phrasing was neutral enough to avoid suggesting criticism of Soviet designs while preserving evidence of the disparity. The tactical implications became more apparent during subsequent operations. In late March, Grigoriev's platoon participated in a rapid advance that covered 70 kilometers in 2 days, a pace that pushed Soviet logistics to its operational limits. The T-34s required emergency refueling from a supply convoy that had been scheduled to support units further forward, creating delays that allowed German forces to establish defensive positions that cost additional casualties to overcome. The Sherman completed the same advance and required only partial refueling, which could have been accomplished from standard platoon reserves without involving the supply chain. Grigoriev noted in his personal log, not official reports, that operational tempo is constrained not by enemy resistance but by fuel logistics designed for equipment that consumes resources inefficiently. This was as close as a Soviet officer could come to stating that American tank design was superior, without explicitly undermining the institutional narrative that Soviet engineering represented the pinnacle of armored vehicle development. If this story has surprised you, leave a like to help the channel. Chesnikov contributed technical analysis that explained why the efficiency disparity existed and why Soviet designers had made different choices. The T-34's diesel engine was selected because diesel fuel was more available in Soviet logistics networks and less prone to fire hazards than gasoline. The simpler transmission reduced manufacturing time and allowed rapid replacement in field conditions, critical factors when industrial capacity was stretched to maximum production levels. The design philosophy accepted higher fuel consumption and more frequent maintenance because the alternative required manufacturing complexity that Soviet factories could not achieve while maintaining production volume. American industry could afford precision engineering and complex powertrains because its industrial base was not under direct attack and could prioritize quality over quantity. Soviet industry had to produce thousands of tanks quickly, using available materials and minimally trained workers. Efficiency was a luxury that survival could not accommodate. But the explanation, while technically accurate, did not eliminate the operational consequences. The T-34 design had been necessary in 1941, when the Soviet Union faced potential annihilation and required maximum production of functional tanks, regardless of individual performance characteristics. But by 1945, with Germany defeated and Soviet forces advancing into Berlin, the original constraints no longer applied. The war was won, but it had been won at a cost that included accepting technical limitations that more sophisticated engineering could have reduced. How many Soviet tank crews had died because their vehicles ran out of fuel during tactical withdrawals? How many offensives had failed to achieve objectives because units had to halt for refueling? The steel carried answers that institutional pride could not acknowledge. The Sherman's fuel efficiency was not just a technical curiosity. It was evidence that Soviet design priorities had been shaped by necessity, but had persisted past the point where those necessities justified the human cost. Comparison reveals what isolation conceals. The Sherman and T-34 were products of different industrial philosophies, different resource constraints, different calculations about the relationship between crew survival and production volume. One was not inherently superior, but one killed its own crews more efficiently through accepted inefficiency. By early April, Grigoriev had accumulated comprehensive documentation of the Sherman's operational characteristics, fuel consumption rates across varied terrain, maintenance requirements during sustained operations, combat performance under conditions identical to those experienced by T-34s in the same unit. The data was detailed, methodologically sound, and politically impossible to submit through official channels. He drafted a technical report that followed standard Red Army format for equipment evaluation. Objective measurements, factual observations, conclusions supported by documented evidence. The report concluded that foreign armored vehicles demonstrate operational characteristics that warrant detailed technical analysis to identify potential improvements in domestic designs. The language was deliberately neutral, avoiding explicit criticism while preserving the essential finding. American tanks were measurably more efficient, and Soviet designs could be improved by studying those efficiency gains. Grigoriev showed the draft to his battalion commander, Major Konstantin Petrov, expecting that the report would be forwarded to higher headquarters for evaluation by technical specialists. Petrov read the document in silence, then placed it in his desk drawer without comment. After a long pause, he explained the political reality that Grigoriev had failed to consider. The Soviet Union's relationship with its Western allies was deteriorating rapidly. Soviet leadership was already preparing for post-war confrontation, and any suggestion that American equipment was superior to Soviet designs would be interpreted as ideological betrayal. The Red Army's industrial achievement was central to the narrative of socialist superiority. Soviet factories had produced more tanks than any nation in history, enabling victory through quantity and efficiency of production. A report suggesting that American tanks were better would undermine that narrative and raise questions about why Soviet designers had not achieved similar performance characteristics. More fundamentally, Petrov explained, the report's conclusions implied that Soviet soldiers had died unnecessarily because design priorities had emphasized production volume over crew survival. This was a truth that could not be officially acknowledged without undermining public confidence in military leadership and industrial planning. The tank crews who had burned in T-34s, the offensives that had stalled due to fuel shortages, the tactical failures caused by limited operational range, all of these could be reframed as consequences of accepted design limitations rather than necessary sacrifices. But reframing required admitting that alternatives existed, which meant admitting that choices had been made that prioritized production metrics over human lives. No Soviet officer with career survival instincts would submit a report that implicitly accused the system of valuing steel more than soldiers. Grigoriev understood. The report was filed in his personal effects rather than official channels, preserved as private documentation of technical findings that the Red Army preferred not to know. This was the institutional mechanism that prevented systemic learning. Observations that contradicted approved narratives were neither investigated nor refuted, simply ignored through the bureaucratic expedient of treating uncomfortable truths as if they didn't exist. The Sherman's fuel efficiency was a fact. The T-34's comparative inefficiency was a fact. But facts that challenged institutional legitimacy were professionally dangerous, and officers who wanted to survive learned to distinguish between what they knew and what they were permitted to document. The suppression extended beyond Grigoriev's battalion. In late April, as Soviet forces fought through Berlin, rumors circulated among tank crews about units that had operated American equipment and discovered superior performance characteristics. The rumors were detailed enough to suggest actual experience rather than speculation, specific fuel consumption figures, maintenance observations, tactical assessments. But when individual soldiers attempted to report these observations formally, they were dismissed or actively discouraged. Political officers emphasized that spreading rumors about foreign equipment superiority constituted defeatist propaganda that undermined confidence in Soviet industrial achievement. Several tank commanders who persisted in discussing the fuel efficiency disparity were reassigned to less desirable positions. The message was clear. The observations might be accurate, but discussing them was politically unacceptable. Volkov's notebook, containing the most detailed documentation of the Sherman's performance, remained hidden throughout the final weeks of the war. After Germany's surrender, his unit was stationed near Potsdam during the occupation period. Volkov briefly considered attempting to submit his findings to Soviet technical authorities, now that combat operations had ended and political sensitivities might be reduced. Chesnokov advised against it. The war's end had not changed institutional priorities. If anything, post-war reconstruction would increase pressure to celebrate Soviet industrial achievement rather than acknowledge its limitations. The notebook would remain private documentation, shared only with crew members who had participated in the unauthorized operation and understood why the findings could not be made public. The final entry in Volkov's notebook, dated May 1945, summarized the findings with the clinical precision of someone documenting technical observations rather than political critique. The M4 Sherman achieves fuel efficiency approximately 1.8 times that of the T-34-85 under comparable operational conditions. This performance differential translates to operational range extension of 40 to 60 kilometers, depending on terrain and tactical circumstances. The efficiency advantage derives from powertrain design that prioritizes mechanical efficiency over manufacturing simplicity. Soviet tank designs accept higher fuel consumption as necessary compromise to enable mass production using available industrial capacity and workforce skill levels. Operational implications. Extended range enables sustained offensive operations without logistics pause. Crew survivability may be enhanced by reduced exposure time during fuel-constrained tactical situations. Recommendation: technical analysis of foreign powertrain designs to identify adaptable efficiency improvements. Political assessment: report not viable through official channels. The steel had spoken, the soldiers had listened, and the system had demonstrated that some knowledge was too dangerous to acknowledge, regardless of its accuracy or tactical significance. The report that documented truth was filed in a drawer rather than official channels. This is how institutions maintain narratives that contradict evidence, not through deception, but through selective acknowledgement that treats uncomfortable facts as if they were opinions rather than measurements. The Sherman was officially reclaimed by salvage operations in June 1945, after Soviet forces had completed initial occupation duties and military administration began systematically accounting for equipment dispersed during combat operations. Volkov surrendered the vehicle without explaining its operational history, and the salvage team documented it as American medium tank, M4 variant, recovered from battlefield, functional condition, recommended for technical evaluation. The vehicle was transported to a depot near Warsaw, where Lend-Lease equipment was being consolidated for potential return to Allied authorities or retention for Soviet use. In the bureaucratic record, the Sherman became inventory item number 3847, one of thousands of foreign vehicles processed through Soviet logistics during the immediate post-war period. Its 3 weeks of unauthorized operation, its documented fuel efficiency, and its role in revealing fundamental design disparities disappeared into the anonymity of military accounting. Grigoriev's career survived the war without consequence from his complicity in Volkov's unauthorized operation. He was promoted to lieutenant colonel in 1946 and assigned to a training command where he taught armored tactics to the next generation of Soviet tank officers. He never mentioned the Sherman's fuel efficiency in official capacity, but his teaching emphasized logistics planning and the critical importance of operational range in mobile warfare. Indirect incorporation of lessons learned from equipment he was not supposed to have evaluated. Years later, former students would recall Grigoriev's insistence that fuel consumption is a tactical factor that commanders ignore at their peril. Few understood that this emphasis derived from unauthorized field testing that had demonstrated how design efficiency directly affected operational capability. The lesson survived even as its origin was forgotten. Volkov returned to civilian life in 1946, accepting a position as a mechanic in a Moscow transportation depot where his military experience and technical competence ensured steady employment. He kept the notebook hidden among his personal possessions, occasionally reviewing the documented fuel consumption data and maintenance observations with the mixture of pride and frustration that characterized his entire relationship with the findings. He had proven something significant, that American tank design achieved measurable efficiency advantages that Soviet designs had sacrificed for production expediency. But the proof existed only in his private records, inaccessible to engineers who might have used the information and unknown to historians who would document the war without understanding the technical compromises that shaped its conduct. The steel had revealed its secrets to a sergeant with primary school education. The secrets remained with him because the system had no mechanism for accepting knowledge that contradicted approved narratives. In 1968, Volkov's daughter discovered the notebook while sorting through her father's belongings after his death. She read the technical entries without fully understanding their significance. The fuel consumption calculations, maintenance observations, and comparative performance assessments meant little to someone without mechanical training or military experience. She mentioned the notebook to a colleague whose husband was a military historian specializing in armored warfare. The historian requested permission to examine the documents. What he found was primary source documentation of field testing that had never been officially conducted, detailed evidence that Soviet soldiers had independently verified performance disparities that post-war analysis had only suspected. The historian began preparing an article for a Soviet military journal, carefully framing the findings as historical curiosity rather than criticism of design decisions. The article was rejected. The editorial board noted that while the documented observations were interesting, Publishing them would raise unnecessary questions about equipment evaluation procedures during the war period and potentially undermine confidence in Soviet industrial achievements. The historian was advised that focusing on such narrow technical details was less valuable than examining broader strategic questions about the war's conduct. The notebook was returned to Volkov's daughter with thanks for her cooperation. She stored it in a box of her father's effects, where it remained until 1991, when she donated her father's military memorabilia to a local museum documenting the Great Patriotic War. The museum accepted the donation but did not catalogue the notebook separately. It became part of a general collection of soldiers' personal effects, stored but not highlighted, preserved but not examined. The institutional resistance to acknowledging the Sherman's efficiency advantages extended beyond Soviet archives. When Western historians gained access to Soviet military records after 1991, they found extensive documentation of Lend-Lease equipment usage, but virtually no technical analysis comparing American and Soviet tank performance. The absence was suspicious. Soviet forces had operated thousands of American tanks under combat conditions that should have generated detailed evaluation reports. The lack of official documentation suggested either that evaluations were never conducted, which seemed implausible given Soviet emphasis on technical analysis, or that evaluations had been conducted but were deliberately not preserved because their conclusions were politically problematic. Volkov's notebook, had it been known to Western researchers, would have confirmed the latter explanation. But the notebook remained in a provincial museum's unsorted archives, unknown to scholars who might have recognized its significance. The Sherman that Volkov operated was likely scrapped in the late 1940s or early 1950s, when Soviet authorities disposed of most Lend-Lease equipment to eliminate dependence on foreign technology and demonstrate industrial self-sufficiency. A few American tanks were preserved in museums as representations of Allied cooperation during the war, but most were broken down for scrap metal that fed post-war reconstruction. The specific vehicle that had revealed fundamental efficiency disparities was indistinguishable from thousands of other Shermans processed through Soviet logistics. Its operational history existed only in documents that no one read and memories that no one recorded. The steel was melted down and reforged. The knowledge it had carried disappeared with it. Evidence survives in silence when systems refuse to acknowledge what the evidence reveals. The notebook documented truth. The truth was filed, stored, and forgotten, not through active suppression, but through institutional indifference to knowledge that contradicted narratives already established. The steel was scrapped, the findings were buried, and the distance between what was known and what was acknowledged remained exactly as wide as the gap between survival and ideology. The fuel efficiency disparity between the Sherman and T-34 was not accidental. It reflected fundamentally different calculations about the relationship between production capacity, crew survival, and operational effectiveness. Soviet tank design emerged from industrial constraints and tactical doctrine that prioritized mass production over individual vehicle performance. The T-34 could be manufactured in factories that lacked precision tooling, assembled by workers with minimal technical training, and maintained by soldiers whose mechanical education consisted of weeks rather than years. This design philosophy enabled production of over 84,000 T-34s during the war, a quantitative achievement unmatched by any other nation. But quantity came with costs that were deliberately accepted as necessary: lower fuel efficiency, shorter operational range, higher maintenance requirements, and mechanical simplicity that made individual tanks less capable than their American counterparts. American tank design reflected different constraints and priorities. The Sherman was produced in a nation whose industrial base was not under direct attack, whose factories could maintain quality control standards, and whose military doctrine emphasized individual vehicle effectiveness over mass production. The result was a tank that cost more to manufacture, required more skilled maintenance, and achieved significantly better fuel efficiency. American designers could afford to optimize powertrain performance because doing so didn't compromise production volume. The industrial capacity existed to manufacture both efficiently and at scale. Soviet designers could not make the same choice. Optimizing individual tank performance would have required manufacturing precision that Soviet factories did not possess during wartime, which meant accepting lower per-vehicle effectiveness to maximize production numbers. The question that Volkov's documentation implicitly raised was whether Soviet design priorities remained optimal once the initial crisis of 1941 to 1942 had passed. By 1945, Soviet industrial capacity had recovered and expanded significantly. Factories that had been evacuated east in 1941 were operating at high efficiency. The workforce had gained experience. The immediate threat of national annihilation had ended. Under these changed circumstances, continuing to produce tanks with accepted inefficiencies made less strategic sense. The fuel consumption disparity that Volkov documented represented a design choice that was defensible under emergency conditions, but became a liability once those conditions no longer existed. But acknowledging this would require admitting that design doctrine had been shaped by temporary constraints that had been treated as permanent limitations. Institutions do not easily admit that their foundational assumptions were contingent rather than optimal. The human cost of this design philosophy was never systematically calculated. Soviet tank casualties were documented in terms of vehicles lost, not crew survival rates. But the fuel efficiency disparity directly affected crew survivability in ways that statistical analysis could reveal if anyone had been interested in conducting it. Tanks that ran out of fuel during combat operations became stationary targets. Crews that had to refuel under fire faced increased exposure to enemy action. Offensives that stalled due to fuel shortages cost additional casualties when the tactical momentum was lost. The Sherman's extended operational range meant American crews faced these risks less frequently. The T-34's limited range meant Soviet crews faced them repeatedly. The difference in fuel consumption translated directly into difference in survival probability. But calculating that difference would require acknowledging that design choices had tactical consequences measured in lives rather than just production metrics. Chesnokov understood this in practical terms that transcended ideological debate. He had maintained T-34s for 3 years and had lost crew members to mechanical failures, fuel shortages, and tactical situations that better equipment might have survived. The Sherman's efficiency was not abstract technical superiority. It was the difference between completing a tactical withdrawal with fuel remaining and running dry with enemy forces closing. It was the difference between maintaining pursuit of retreating enemy forces and halting to refuel while they escaped. It was the difference between having options during combat and being constrained by equipment limitations that the crew could not overcome through skill or courage. Design philosophy was measured in steel and engineering specifications, but it was experienced in burned friends and missions that failed for want of 50 additional kilometers of operational range. The post-war period saw Soviet tank design gradually incorporate efficiency improvements that suggested silent acknowledgement of the lessons that could not be officially learned from wartime experience. The T-34, introduced in 1949, featured a more sophisticated transmission and improved fuel efficiency compared to the T-34. The design changes were attributed to ongoing technical development rather than analysis of foreign equipment, but the improvements aligned suspiciously well with the performance characteristics that American tanks had demonstrated during the war. Soviet engineers knew about the fuel efficiency disparity. They had operated Shermans extensively and understood the technical factors that produced superior performance. But institutional protocol required that these insights be rediscovered independently, rather than acknowledged as lessons learned from foreign designs. The steel evolved. The narrative pretended the evolution was autonomous. The ideological dimension complicated any honest assessment of design priorities. Acknowledging that American tanks were more efficient required admitting that capitalist industry could produce superior results in at least some dimensions of engineering performance. This contradicted the foundational claim that socialist industrial organization represented the superior system. Soviet propaganda emphasized quantity. More tanks produced, more weapons manufactured, more industrial output per capita. Discussing quality meant opening debates about whether quantity alone was sufficient measure of industrial achievement. The fuel efficiency disparity revealed that quality and quantity existed in tension, and that Soviet choices had prioritized one at the expense of the other. This was accurate technical analysis. It was also ideological heresy that could not be acknowledged without undermining the legitimacy claims that justified the entire political system. Design philosophy is ideology rendered in steel. The T-34 prioritized production volume over crew survival because the system valued numerical superiority over individual effectiveness. The Sherman achieved better efficiency because American industry could afford optimization. Both approaches succeeded in their contexts, but only one required soldiers to accept unnecessary deaths as the cost of industrial limitations that could have been overcome if survival had been weighted as heavily as production metrics. Dmitry Volkov died in 1968 at the age of 49. From lung complications related to chemical exposure during his post-war work in industrial maintenance. His obituary in the factory newsletter described him as a dedicated worker and veteran of the Great Patriotic War who served with distinction in armored units. There was no mention of unauthorized tank operations, no reference to fuel efficiency documentation, no acknowledgement that he had discovered and documented evidence that Soviet tank design accepted casualties that better engineering could have prevented. The notebook that contained his findings remained in family possession until his daughter's donation to a provincial museum in 1991. By then, the Soviet Union was collapsing. The ideological constraints that had suppressed honest technical analysis were dissolving, and the evidence that had been too dangerous to acknowledge for 46 years had become historically interesting but tactically irrelevant. The steel's testimony had survived. The opportunity to learn from it had passed. Pavel Grigoriev retired from the Soviet Army in 1968 with the rank of colonel, having spent 23 years in various training and administrative positions. He never publicly discussed the Sherman operation or the suppressed technical report, but his teaching methodology subtly incorporated lessons that could only have derived from comparative analysis of American and Soviet equipment. Former students recalled his emphasis on logistics planning, his insistence that fuel consumption was a critical tactical factor, and his teaching that operational range directly affected combat effectiveness. These were not standard emphases in Soviet armored doctrine, which focused more on mass assault and numerical superiority. Grigoriev's approach suggested someone who had learned that individual vehicle performance mattered more than official doctrine acknowledged. He died in 1983, and his personal papers were disposed of by relatives who did not recognize their military historical significance. The draft technical report that he had written in April 1945 was likely destroyed during this process. Ivan Chesnokov returned to factory work after the war, eventually becoming a senior maintenance supervisor at a heavy equipment manufacturing plant. He never spoke about the Sherman operation except once, in 1975, when he was interviewed for an oral history project documenting wartime industrial workers. The interviewer asked whether Soviet tanks were adequately designed for combat conditions. Chesnokov's answer was carefully phrased: "The T-34 was designed for the conditions we faced. Rapid production with available materials and workforce capabilities. It served its purpose." The design served different purposes under different constraints. The interviewer did not press for clarification. Chesnokov's response was recorded and archived without further analysis. He died in 1979. His knowledge of the Sherman's technical superiority died with him, preserved nowhere except in Volkov's notebook that no one had read. The Sherman that Volkov operated was likely destroyed during the scrapping of Lend-Lease equipment in the early 1950s, though the lack of individual vehicle tracking makes definitive identification impossible. Soviet authorities disposed of most American equipment during this period as part of a broader policy to eliminate dependence on foreign technology and demonstrate industrial self-sufficiency. A few Shermans were retained for museum display or technical study, but the vast majority were broken down for scrap metal. If the specific vehicle that had revealed fundamental design disparities still exists, it sits in a museum somewhere, its operational history unknown, and its contribution to understanding Soviet tank design limitations unacknowledged. The steel carried evidence. The evidence was melted down before anyone official chose to examine it. The technical knowledge that Volkov documented did eventually influence Soviet tank design, but through indirect channels that avoided acknowledging the source. Soviet engineers who had operated or maintained American equipment during the war carried practical understanding of design features that produced superior performance. As they advanced in their careers and gained influence over new design projects, they incorporated elements that addressed the limitations they had observed in T-34s. The T-54's improved transmission, the T-55's enhanced fuel efficiency, the gradual optimization of powertrain performance across successive generations, all reflected lessons learned from comparative experience with foreign equipment. But the design evolution was documented as independent technical development rather than adaptation of American engineering principles. The steel taught lessons that could only be learned through silent imitation rather than acknowledged study. In 2003, a Russian military historian named Alexei Volkov, no relation to Dmitry, was researching Lend-Lease equipment usage when he discovered references in archived logistics documents to Soviet units operating American tanks beyond their assigned allocation periods. The discrepancies suggested unauthorized retention of foreign equipment, possibly for evaluation purposes that were never formally documented. Volkov attempted to locate technical reports that should have existed if such evaluations occurred. He found none in central archives. He expanded his search to include provincial museums and veteran organizations, hoping to find personal documentation that might preserve what official records had omitted. Through this process, he discovered Dmitry Volkov's notebook in a museum storage facility in Kursk. The notebook was catalogued as Personal Effects, Sergeant D. Volkov, 1945, with no indication of its contents or significance. Alexei Volkov published an article in 2005 analyzing the notebook's contents and arguing that it represented primary source evidence of systematic technical evaluation that Soviet authorities had suppressed because the findings contradicted official narratives about Soviet industrial superiority. The article generated brief academic interest, but no broader recognition. Western historians noted it as interesting footnote material, but did not consider it significant enough to alter existing interpretations of Soviet armor doctrine. Russian historians acknowledged the documentation, but emphasized that Soviet design priorities were appropriate for the strategic and industrial circumstances that existed during wartime. The notebook was returned to museum storage. The evidence it contained was acknowledged as factually accurate but historically marginal, an interesting anomaly rather than revelatory documentation of systemic failure to learn from available evidence. The fundamental lesson that Dmitry Volkov documented in 1945 remains unincorporated into military historical analysis. That institutional narratives often survive evidence that contradicts them, not through active suppression alone, but through the bureaucratic inertia that treats uncomfortable knowledge as if it were merely opinion rather than measured fact. The Sherman achieved nearly double the fuel efficiency of the T-34. This was demonstrable, replicable, and documented by multiple soldiers operating under field conditions. But acknowledging the disparity required admitting that Soviet design philosophy had prioritized production volume over crew survival in ways that cost lives unnecessarily once industrial constraints no longer justified those priorities. The system chose not to acknowledge what the steel had revealed. The choice was never documented, never justified, never explained. It simply happened. Through draft reports filed in drawers, through oral history interviews that avoided sensitive questions, through archived documents that no one read. The steel spoke truth that institutions refused to hear. The Sherman ran twice as far on the same fuel. Soviet soldiers documented this. Soviet officers verified it. And the system buried the evidence not through conspiracy, but through the ordinary operation of bureaucracy that treats knowledge as threat when knowledge contradicts the narratives that justify power. The tank was scrapped, the notebook was filed, and the distance between what was known and what was acknowledged remained exactly as wide as the gap between mechanical fact and political necessity. Subscribe to our channel to explore more archived and disturbing cases. Thank you for following Dmitry Volkov's story. See you in the next video.